Welcome to the Rebranding Christianity podcast. This podcast is for people who care about the state of contemporary Christianity in America. The church, particularly the evangelical church, is in a time of upheaval. Some within the church recognize the diminishing influence of Christianity in America and have decided to dig in and engage in culture wars and try to win back lost ground. Others feel disillusioned or even a bit duped by a brand of Christianity that they can no longer support. Still others love and support the church but are confused and heartbroken that their kids have walked away and want nothing to do with their faith. Regardless, it's a disorienting time to be a Christian in America. We're going to talk about that in this episode of Rebranding Christianity. I'm Cindy Park.
And I'm Greg Holmes. In this episode, we are continuing our conversations with Jeff Jones and Mike Hogan, co-authors of Rebranding Christianity, When the World's Most Important Brand Loses Its Way. Now, we've talked about in previous episodes what we mean by the word brand and what we mean by the word branding and why that's helpful and important as we're talking about Christianity. And in short, brands provide a shorthand understanding of what a product or person or a movement is all about. So when we think of a certain brand, we're actually thinking about all of the products and the promises and the values that we associate with that brand. So when a brand violates its promises or becomes known for negative things like bad product or poor customer service or et cetera, the brand loses public trust and begins to diminish. Then, in the last episode, we went way back and we looked at the brand that Jesus gave us 2,000 years ago. So in today's episode, we're going to combine those two thoughts and talk about what's really at the heart of this book. And that is when people outside the church are asked to describe Christianity, typically they don't describe what Jesus told us to be known for. So it appears that Christianity has a branding problem. And Jeff, I would love to start with you, a question with you, because I read a story that you wrote about in the book. I've actually heard you talk about this story as well. And you were at a conference speaking about this topic with Christian leaders and things like that, and you had a pretty interesting experience. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, for a pastor's conference. Yeah, I was talking about the problem we have, and by the way, we will get to solution.
Yes, right. It'll get hopeful.
These conversations about it can feel bleak, but it's very possible to recapture our brand and recapture a culture. But yeah, I was speaking at this pastor's conference about rebranding Christianity and it was exciting. It was this packed out room, people were in, and so I'm talking about the problem, about the difference, the gap between our brand and the way people perceive us outside of us. And this girl raises her hand, and I said, yeah, what? And I said, you have a question? And she said, no, I just have a statement. And I said, yeah, what would you like to say? And she said, Christians are full of rhymes with spit. Okay. I'm not a cussing guy. Just that cool. Some pastors do that.
Yeah, some pastors can get away with it.
Cool to do it. And I did it on the audio book because we spell it out in the book because it's her comment, it's her story, it's her. But I'll just keep it with spit. Okay. Right. Kind of like the show The Good Place. Where you can't cuss. But so she just says, I can tell you your problem. Christians are full of spit.
Right.
And I was like, oh, okay. So would you like
that can kind of kill the mood in a room.
Yeah, it was really cool in the sense of, if people were asleep.
Now it's gotten real.
There, yeah. And I said, man, I'd love for you to tell me more. Like, why would you say that? And she's very eloquent. And she said, well, I've been sitting here all morning. This was in the afternoon, wondering why in the world I'm here at a conference like this. So my friend invited me. I'm not a Christian, have no desire to be a Christian. And I didn't know this is what this was until I got here, that this is a conference for like pastors. And so I've been going through this stuff and wondering, why am I here? I said, I believe I'm here for this, because I'm the person you're talking about. Because what you guys need to hear about yourselves is, when I say Christians are full of spit, it's because you say wonderful things and you claim wonderful things about yourself, but you do the opposite. And you're hypocritical and you're mean and you're judgmental and you exclude those who are already so excluded in our culture. And she just went on, right, as you can imagine. And she said, my experience has been when I say Christians are full of spit, that Christians are the worst of humanity.
Wow.
And then she did say, but my friend that invited me, the reason I said yes is because she's not the norm. Like she's not like that. And that's what keeps me interested. That's what keeps me in the game. But by and large, the problem you have is Christians are full of spit. That's your problem.
Well, she's not the only one that feels that way. There's some data that teaches us how emerging generations view Christianity. So can you share a little bit of that with us?
Sure. And by the way, just to kind of finish out her story, because I think that's interesting, is that she said that, and you can read her what she said in the book, but I just said, okay, so if you're up for it, from now on, it's you and me doing the session together. So anytime you have a thought, you jump in. And occasionally I'm just going to point to you and say, I'd like to know what you think about what we just said. And she said, I'm in. I'll do that.
Wow.
And she was great. And I couldn't have hired an actor to do that any better. Like, she was just incredible. I mean, she was a real thing, but it made that session, way better. And then at the end, I talked to her for, 20 or 30 minutes, and I could tell she was pulled closer, just because she had been heard. She'd been respected. She didn't expect to be. She expected to be shunned, invited to leave the room or whatever. And I think that's instructive in itself. I mean, we can talk about that kind of stuff later, how you approach those who don't understand you or who you feel like misunderstood or whatever. But I think she walked out a lot closer to the opportunity, to God, than when she came in. Not just because of me, but because of how the whole group interacted with her. It was great. So yeah, but I think she's representative. I mean, she was probably 22 years old or something like that. And I think she was very representative of her generation. And we talked about this before in this podcast, another episode. But if you're not depressed enough already, and you just want to be more depressed, all you have to do is Google Christianity in America, and you'll see the problem, right? All the polls and all the studies show the same thing. A huge one was in March 2021, where there was this major inflection point where, for the first time in history, less than half Americans were connected to a faith community. And by the way, that's all faith communities. That's not just Christianity. But that's really massive that, less than half of them. But then when you dial down and you see it by generation, and by church membership, even more specific. So 66% of busters, which are people who were born before 1946, claim to be church members. So that's 66% of our grandparents, or I don't know who's listening, maybe it's you. 58% of boomers, people born between 1946 and 64. 50% Gen X. I'm a Gen Xer, age 65, born 65 to 80. 36% of millennials. So what I'm trying to say is it's going the wrong direction, right? And then right now, Gen Z is still in process, but it's certainly less than millennials. So I don't know if that's 25% or 30% or whatever, but so you go from 66% to, let's say, 28% on the Gen Z. That's a massive problem, right? And I remember Dwight Jewson, who contributed to the book at the end of the book, when he looks at some different statistics, and he says, if Christianity were my client, this would be catastrophic. This wouldn't be just like, I think we might have a problem. Like, this is like, we're going out of business. Like, we're not going to exist. Like, it's that catastrophic, because the way there's just the way we are perceived by the emerging generations is really completely opposite to the brand, and therefore they're checking out.
Yeah. So there's a really interesting chart in the book. And so it describes like the way Gen Z views us versus those who are in the church. But if Gen Z and others outside of the church view us as only accepting of people who will fit into certain parameters, what about Jesus followers that say, hey, but don't we need to speak up for what's right? If we're just inclusive and kind and accept all kinds of people, then won't we just look like everybody else in the world? And Scripture tells us we're in the world, but not of the world. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. How do we represent truth to our world? How do we represent Jesus to our world? Because we do want to be influential. We're not saying that truth doesn't matter or belief in Jesus doesn't matter. It does. It's just how do we portray truth? How do we represent Jesus in a way that actually is not repulsive, but makes people want to hear? I remember years ago having some conversations with Mike. Hi, Mike, who's here with us too. Who we were talking about. Well, it was your word, push versus pull, and how I should probably let you talk about that since you're the one that did it. So talk a little bit about push versus pull, and then I'll take it.
Yeah, sure. So from a marketing perspective, right, push is sort of what you're sending out to people, right? Pull, it goes, remember that net promoter thing that we had last time. When you have people coming wanting the demand for your product or telling other people about it, if I'm out in the marketplace trying to find the next clever message or price discounting or whatever, that's called push marketing. When I have something that people really want, that's attractive, that people are asking for, that's pull marketing, and pull marketing is always better. And I think there's always a mix of those, but I think the challenge, for Christianity is, right, you do have to be attractive. And by that, I don't mean that we need to be the most popular religion in a poll. What I mean is that the irony to me in all of this is that the core message of Jesus is still a very attractive message. You're not going to do a poll where 80% of people say, I don't like Jesus or who he was, and I think this concept of unconditional love and grace is horrific. People actually like it. The problem is that they're not seeing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in Jesus' day, the people who experienced pull are the people who were the outsiders, the people who were shunned, like that kind of stuff. The people who experienced a little bit of harshness from Jesus were those that were, the religious insiders. So it was a very different.
And I love the way Peter talked to Christians in Rome, like right in Rome. So they were in a very pagan area, and there are all kinds of terrible, all kinds of sinful things happening. All that. He doesn't tell them, man, you need to go and boycott this group, and you need to have a sign. You need to, push. What he talked about is pull, and he was just like he says it. He says, hey, your friends wonder why you don't get drunk at dinner parties anymore, and you're not doing, which drunkenness would have been orgies and drunkenness and the whole, like, why don't you do that anymore? And they're wondering about that, which means they're having conversations with you. And he says, so, when people ask the reason for the hope you have, be ready for an answer. So it's not push your morality or push your point of view on people before they care or before they even want to hear it or whatever. It's live such a good life. I mean, we're told this elsewhere in the Bible, to live such good lives among the pagans, it says, that actually does create pull, that makes them want to ask questions like, what's the reason for the hope that you have, and so on. And so we'll talk about in the book how to do that. But we're not saying truth doesn't matter or Jesus doesn't matter or what you believe doesn't matter. It does. We're just talking about how you live that out in culture that creates a sense of pull, that creates a sense of attraction, that creates curiosity. And I think what you see in church history is that our brand, which is radical love displayed, any time in church history when Christians do that, it is an irresistible force for good. It is hard to explain away love. You can explain away, I believe this and you believe that. You can explain all that away. But it is really hard to explain away sacrificial love. And then it makes people wonder, man, what causes these, like, who does that? Like, what makes them tick? Like, why would they live this way? And that's the difference of push versus pull. I mean, we're also told not to judge those outside the faith. Yeah. Like with our values, like, Paul says, who are we to judge those outside the faith? We can hold each other accountable to what we believe and what we hold to. That makes sense. But some individual, organization, or even our country, makes a decision. I wouldn't, why would I expect them to behave as if they knew Jesus and therefore had signed up for our value system? They haven't. So, it's not about imposing our morality. It's about loving people into a relationship with Jesus that does point people to a whole new way of life.
Yeah.
But we have to get that order right. Like Jesus, I need to stop. But,
and we're going to talk a lot more about that in future episodes on what does it mean for us to live into a better brand, the brand that we talked about in the last episode. Mike, I have a question for you about if Christianity has a branding problem, which I think we can agree with. It seems like that the last group to sort of admit that we have a problem are the people, are the brand owners themselves. Jeff, you talked about the story. You're talking to other pastors or whatever, and then someone has to say, all right, everyone who owns the problem, you guys are full of spit. Is that, in your experience in working with brands, is that unique to us? Or is that pretty common that those who are the primary brand owners are the last to admit that there's a problem when there's a brand problem?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I've worked or ran or consulted with a lot of brands and businesses, and I would say that in situations of brand or decline, believe it or not, denial is probably more the rule than the exception.
Yeah.
Right? Think of it as sort of phase one is overcoming denial, and you got to get past that to get anywhere else. I've seen this story unfold many times, and I think what happens, right, is we get emotionally invested in something. We're emotionally invested in our brand, our church, our business, whatever. And, as the saying goes, nobody likes to hear that their baby is ugly, right? But you have to have a discipline of looking at the facts, right, and being externally focused and asking the tough questions. I remember way back in my PepsiCo days, one of our flagship brands was Doritos. So this was in probably the early 90s, and we had a lot of competitors. We were losing market share, right? There were a lot of new brands on the market, and our initial response of the brand was to deny the competition. Well, you don't understand, that's not really our competition. That's low-priced products, or that's whatever. In fact, they're not in the same category. It actually went so far as after a year or two, the brand group came up with this concept to say we're no longer measuring market share of tortilla chips. We're measuring, and believe me, I'm not making this up. Trust me, we're measuring share of Dorito-like objects, which basically meant nacho flavored chips that sold at a very high price per pound. And, not surprisingly.
In triangle shapes.
And not surprisingly, we weren't losing share in that category. So, but of course, the business continued to go south. Now, it was absurd, and ultimately new management came in and was able to turn this around. But, nobody likes to admit they're losing. I think, Cadillac, I know, went through a similar phase in the 90s. They got to the point where, the average customer was like 65 years old. And it was the product that helped turn it around initially was the Escalade, and they had this great advertising campaign and innovation. So I think, yes, absolutely. It's probably generally true that the brand owners are the last to see, or maybe I should say, maybe not see, but the last to acknowledge what everyone else sees. And this is a lot like the church, right? I think that those outside the church have observed, and we talk about this, what are going on, and talking about it for a long time. I think what they're waiting for is to see if someone in the church will admit it and start doing something about it.
So what is, just in a general sense, what is necessary, what has to happen, or what's required for brand owners to take that kind of brand ownership and say, this is not about everything else and our competitors. This is we're the owners of the brand. We need to take ownership. We need to do something about this. What has to happen to get there?
Yeah, I think I would say two things. Generally speaking, the first one is, I'm going to call it internal transparency. And this is sort of what we just talked about, being honest with ourselves, right? In the case of the church, it means being honest about the data. You can say what you want, but you can't deny what's happening with church attendance and attitudes and all the polls. So it's in decline, particularly amongst the youngest generations. And by the way, one of the things you always look at in marketing is by age, because if you're not winning with the next generation, you're losing. Right. Unfortunately, we do still see a lot of excuses and blaming others. The media is biased, whatever else it is. And by the way, I'm not saying the media isn't biased. I'm just saying that's not really the core problem here. Right. What I think we need to do is come clean and look in the mirror. And here's an important distinction. I think the important question to ask is not how can we, the church, be popular. So I don't want anybody to think that this is just about a survey and a popularity test and so on. The important question to ask is, are we in fact truly living out the brand promise that Jesus established 2,000 years ago, right? So that's internal transparency. The second is external transparency, right? Once we're honest with ourselves about the problem, then we can be honest with others, those who are watching the church. We talked about this before, but they already know what the problem is. They're just waiting to see whether we'll own up to it. And I think one of the interesting things about branding in the 21st century is that people are pretty forgiving, right, if you level with them. They don't expect perfection, but they won't tolerate obfuscation and double talk. And you see how frustrated people are with, for example, politicians and the continual lying and denying and changing the subject no matter what side of the aisle people are on. But when someone just says, hey, we blew it, here's what we're about. Nobody disagrees with the value. Nobody would be offended that the church is trying to be more loving as Jesus loved us. We just need to get out. I think in chapter 6, right, there's a story in there which we'll probably talk about next time of Domino's Pizza. And it's a great brand story of a brand that denied the problem for a long time, finally admitted to the problem, was very transparent about it, worked hard at it, and the brand grew like tenfold after they did that. So to me, it's a very inspirational story.
Well, maybe an example of a brand that hasn't done that super well is Comcast.
Yep.
And you talk about that in the book. So can you tell us about that and tell us how Comcast is like the church?
Yeah, sure. I think we picked Comcast, because it's sort of the poster child for a brand that people love to hate. Pretty much everybody's had the experience of, right, the cable company saying, we're going to be there this afternoon, make you wait all day, and then they don't show up or whatever. In fact, there was even this, I'm probably dating myself here, but there was this great Seinfeld episode about this where the cable guy kept trying to get into Kramer's apartment and Kramer flipped it, because he was never there when the cable guy showed up, and they've famously had a negative net promoter score for years. So I think that Comcast is like the church in that somewhere along the way they just lost focus on the objective and started asking the wrong questions. And most people don't think about like, okay, what's actually going on in the corporate boardroom or whatever. But if you think about it, it's not like Comcast senior management is having all these meetings going, how can we find ways to annoy people and drive away our customers? I mean, when you look at so that we know they're not doing that. These are smart people trying to grow their business, but somehow what they end up doing ends up driving off customers. And I think in the same way that, church leaders aren't. I've never been in a church meeting where people are talking about how can we annoy people and drive away the people we're trying to attract, but their actions end up producing that result. Yeah. And so, if you think about Comcast, right, their core job is I need to provide a quality product, which is cable, at a reasonable price with good customer service. But at some point, they stop asking that question. They start asking
if they just did that, they'd be fine.
They would be fine, right. And they start asking other questions like, some, smart finance person, I'm going to pick on finance people here, shows up and says, well, you know what? If we just told people the whole afternoon instead of giving an appointment time, that would be a lot easier for us, but not easier for them, right? And it probably saved a little money or whatever. And I think the same thing, with the church, everything else is secondary to the core mission. What happens when we allow ourselves to get drawn into other issues? And I can certainly see these conversations and these meetings where whatever the issue of the day is really, really important. And people are, let's be honest, people are passionate in business, but they're really passionate in church, right? They're passionate about these things. And we allow ourselves to get drawn into that. And then what happens is when people understandably respond negatively of this, instead of hearing their voices, right, instead of saying, wow, something's wrong, we shut them out. We go back to our own echo chamber and we only listen to the voices of those people who agree with us. Jeff, I'm sure you see this in the church all the time, all these other things coming up that distract us from the core mission.
Yeah, and that's the story of what's gone wrong, which we'll talk about in a future episode here of just mission drift. So we have the gospel, we have the good news that we're supposed to live out in a way that's compelling so that we can share in a way that people can connect with a God who loves beyond what anybody can understand. And yet it's just so hard to stay focused on that. And there's all kinds of mission drift that's gone on in the church, right? As we've added and allowed different other things to take over. And that's where we're at. And that's, and I think, when we talk about owning the problem, if we're honest enough to look and see that Jesus gave us the brand to manage, this is how people know if you love one another the way I've loved. If that's not the way we're known, then it's our problem. It's not their problem. It's not somebody else's problem. It's not people being unfair. It's our problem to manage. He gave it to us to manage. So we are the brand managers. We are the brand ambassadors, so to speak. And therefore, if there is a branding problem, and I don't know how you would possibly look at what's going on in our culture and say that we don't have a branding problem, it's our problem. And it's doable. We're going to see that in church history. The first century church had a much bigger problem than we do. I mean, it was this little group of people, and the whole Roman world was, it was emperors, in particular, the people in power wanted it stamped out, and they did everything they could to do that. But this very maligned, persecuted group of people won over a very skeptical world by essentially just doing what Jesus told them to do, empowered by God, loving in ways that, and it's so cool to even look in church history and you can see Caesars and other people talking about this. I mean, these Christians, look how they love one another. It's the way one person said it. Like, how can we compete with that? And priests in their religion, because charity wasn't part of their religion, you have these priests in history saying things to emperors because emperors were frustrated and saying, maybe we should start caring for the poor like they do. Because it's just not something that was part of their deal. But the populace looked at what happened and looked at how they loved their enemies that were persecuting them and all that. And they won over their world. So this is very doable. We just have to remember what we were asked to do in the first place 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. Mike, I'm wondering, because it might be easy for Jeff to talk about this and to put these things into practice because he's a pastor. That's his whole life and profession. But for you, you're coming at it from a business perspective. And so what does push and pull around your faith look like for you? How does that play out in your actual daily life or relationships?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it comes back to this continually reminding of what the core mission is. And the example here I'll give is my friendship with Dwight Jewson, who's the third author of this, of this book. And so Dwight and I have known each other for probably 30 years, as long as Jeff and I have known each other. And Dwight's truly a brand guru. I mean, he's the person that when, CEOs of companies have a brand problem, he's the person that they call. And so, we got to know each other in the early 90s, or late 90s, and ultimately, we'd talk about everything that was important. Interestingly enough, he grew up in the church too. He was probably a lot more serious about the church growing up than I was before he left. And so naturally the conversation shifted and we would talk about our faith and such as it was and so on. And I he happens to live in a blue city in a blue state. He lives in Seattle. So his views on a lot of things are very different than mine. And we developed this relationship where there's this underlying trust of each other and our values, and we can talk about a lot of things. And I can remember one time he called me, and this was many years ago. This is when Bill Clinton was still president. And he said, yeah, I got this call, and I'm going to go to this. And I said, Well, it turns out the call was from Bill Clinton to come to the White House to meet with Bill and Hillary and talk about him helping to manage her Senate campaign. So that, first of all, it gives you a sense of sort of the circles that he runs in, but it also gives you a sense of which side of the aisle he might be in. And it probably wouldn't be a hard guess to say that I might have voted the other direction. But, as we started talking about all these things, what we found is that if we get underneath it and say, okay, but we probably disagree on methodology, right, or ways. But, particularly as we got to this book, and it was fascinating for me to say, if you lay out everything in this book, he would say, yeah, I'm a nun. I don't have much interest in the church, but absolutely, I believe in the message of Jesus, and I think it would be wonderful for the church to be more this way. So for me, I think keeping a diverse group of friends is really important, trying to listen to another point of view, because I've yet to have an experience where you can't get through, and when you realize that if you can have alignment on that most important thing, and Jeff says this a lot about not letting these other things divide us, right? And in the church we get all passionate about this doctrine or thing. And I've been part of churches over the years that are like, kind of like, hey, by the way, nobody else is really going to heaven. That kind of thing. Don't tell them, but they're not going to heaven,
Right.
And so I think for me, I've seen the damage that can do with divide. So I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying I do it well all the time, but I think finding friendships and relationships and commitments and things, just like why am I friends with Jeff? He's a good guy, but mostly he makes me a better person than I would otherwise be. And so finding ways to kind of try to stay focused on what that primary thing is.
I've seen in my own life, and I've went through seminary and I'm a pastor, and I kind of had early on in my Christian life this expectation that as I grew in wisdom and as I, that I would just become more and more sure about more and more things. And I would just, and now my view is, at the time there were a whole lot of things I was holding on to really, really tightly that were kind of things that I was passionate about, and some other things I was kind of loosey-goosey on. And I've since learned, okay, some of these things I was kind of loose on, I actually need to hold on tightly to. This is really, really important. And some of the other things I was holding on tightly to, I really need to lighten up, because there's some really great people that disagree with me, and I need to, like all of that kind of stuff. And in some respect, I see that's a little bit of what this book is about. It's not addressing every issue that the Bible talks about. It's just talking about the most important one. So if we get this one wrong, then a lot of the other stuff doesn't matter, because this is the thing that we need to be sort of holding tightly to. Yeah. Jeff, I want to revisit how we started this conversation with you talking to pastors. I think that within Christian circles, kind of the party line is, even if we do sort of admit that we're kind of in a diminishing phase, like we have a branding problem, that it's because of bad press, or it's because of shifting moral values, and we're just, like that kind of stuff. But when you talk to, like at that conference, or when you talk to other Christian leaders and say, no, this is our problem, what's the response that you get? Is it pushback, or is it, yeah, you're probably right? What kind of response do you get?
I'll answer it a little bit differently with everybody that I've talked to.
Okay.
Not just pastors. But, so when I talk to people in my world who are not churched, and I just honestly talk about the branding problem that we have, and that it's our problem, and so on, that, this is the Christian brand, and I don't have to tell them how we're perceived. They know that right away. But when I say the brand, they're like, wow, that's your deal, really? All of them pretty much have very quickly said, yeah, you've got a problem. You're right.
Yeah. If you think you're known for that, trust me, you're not known for that. Right. Yeah.
And so it creates curiosity, and like, wow, I want to know more about that. Or I want to get the book. I want to talk to you more about it. I've been really surprised by that. Just the honest admission, confession that we are not who we're called to be, and we know it, and we're going to do something about it. It's just been like, wow, they know it, but the fact that we know it and are willing to admit it, and then you've got people who are Christians who've been hurt by church and are kind of trying to hang on to church. And for them, it gives them hope that somebody like me, a pastor of a large church in Dallas, is talking honestly about our problem and wanting to be the kind of church that Jesus called us to be, or be the kind of Christians Jesus called us to be. And for them, it's like it's given a sense of hope. For people in the middle, it's people who are Christians but who are just uneasy or who see the problems. Just, for them, it's given a sense of direction a little bit. But then there are people who've been defensive. Yeah. And I think, and those people are people, in my experience, who are just so much in the bubble, they just can't see it. And because in the bubble, it feels pretty good, and so it's hard for them to see the problem when you're in the bubble. And because it's a self-reinforcing little thing, and so it's easy to have a persecution complex, and we're mistreated, or our world is going down the tubes, and all this. And and even being frustrated, like one person, as of this podcast, not many people have read the book because it's not in print yet. But I've had different people read it in different groups. And one person who read it, who's, a nice person, but in the bubble, was really offended by the Christians are full of spit thing. Like, why would you write that? For one, you didn't say spit, right? But also, why would you give a voice to a person like that? Like, we don't need to give a voice to a person like that. There's enough people that are saying terrible things about Christianity. Why would you write a book and give a voice to somebody like that? Which is really interesting perspective. And I said, well, the reason is because she is a voice for a whole generation that is repulsed by church. And she was very eloquently spoke for a whole generation of people that, and let's remember how urgent this is. God so loved the world that he sent his one and only son right into the world to give his life for people like her. And when his people who are tasked with that message and to emulate that message and to live that in a way that people like her would want to know more, would actually be able to believe there's a God who exists and who loves her beyond what she can imagine. We're the ones in the gap. And so if we get our brand wrong, then we frustrate the heart of God more than we can possibly imagine, because he loves people like her more than we can possibly imagine, just like he loves us. And so this problem, when I say we've got a problem, it's not a market share problem to me. It's not a my church isn't as big as it could be problem. I don't care about that. Well, I do. I shouldn't. But this is there's not a more urgent problem on the planet. I mean, this is, and for us as Christians, if we're misrepresenting the heart of God to people that he desperately loves, just like Jesus when he came to the Pharisees, who was very upset with them, not because they were bad people, not because they were wanting to do the wrong thing. They were good people trying to do good things, but they misrepresented the heart of God and had ruined religion in such a way that he was just, you have all the woes. Woe is you, woe is you, woe is you. He wasn't just a little bit frustrated. And so I think when he looks at what's happening in our situation, and I'm not talking about other people. I've been a leader in the evangelical movement for a long time, that when we say people like me, people like all of us need to take responsibility, it is urgent. It's also urgent because our culture is not doing well without Jesus.
Yeah.
Right.
And everything that we're created to experience can only be found in our Creator. And we're the ones who know that, and we're the ones who represent that, and we're the ones who have the good news. And in a culture where the number one killer of a whole generation right now is suicide, this is urgent. And it's not just about how big churches are. This is urgent. And so for me as a pastor, the reason I'm writing the book, the reason I'm doing this, because it's controversial. Some of this is going to be controversial and, all that. And why would I do it? And the reason I'm doing it is because of that urgency and the urgency of the mission, the urgency of the love of God for people like her and millions of others like her. And on my watch, this has happened.
Yeah.
And we've got to do something about it.
So there is this urgency because there's been this growing disdain of the Christian church in America. But while that's been happening, there's also been massive cultural shifts. So did those cultural shifts cause what we've been talking about, or did they accelerate what was already happening? We'll talk about that next time on Rebranding Christianity.